Architecture is really the art and science of turning fiction into fact.
Sometimes kind of real architectural life interferes with intellectual architectural life.
There is no such thing as architecture.
Hello everyone, this is Vikram Prakash and you are yet once again listening to Architecture Talk. Each week we try and have a conversation with a contemporary thinker on issues of architecture and architectural thinking, and our intention is to expand our horizons of what architecture is and what it could be in the future. And I think that's certainly going to happen today once you listen to today's podcast, which is with my good old friend and collaborator Mark Jarzombek, with whom I also recorded the inaugural episode of this podcast, and with whom I have been working for a very long time on a variety of projects, including most recently the past decade or so on the global project, on the global architectural history teaching project, the global textbook project, and in general the larger project of thinking globally. Last time we conversed and recorded, we talked about one of his episodes, one of his modules for GAHTC on the architecture of the first societies. Today we have a much open, much more far-ranging and much more contestative discussion on everything, on history, on modernity, on the status of modernism, on the Enlightenment, and even on Derrida and its implications. So here we go, Global Thinking with Mark Jarzombek. Well, welcome to Architecture Talk again, Mark.
Thank you for having me back. It's always a pleasure to speak to you.
So today I was doing one of your GAHTC lectures on the Magdalenian culture and civilization.
Oh, the caves.
And I also, the caves, and I
Yeah.
also overlapped it with the discussion of the Gravetians and the northern hunting tradition and the
Yep.
differences between the Lavus and the Tipis.
Yeah.
And I had a great time in class, sort of revisiting this first society's discussion that we had in our very first conversation on Architecture Talk. But like we discussed, I thought today, we should have a much more, or like you said, a two-way conversation. This is like you and me chatting, right?
Yep.
And I thought it'd be, great. Let's try and talk about the meanings and purports, of course, but also the, if you like, ambitions and unknown ambitions of our global project. Yeah.
Mhm.
Which is to say, now we have been at this. Well, we started with the textbook, which was 15 years ago. 15 years ago?
Oh, more, right?
18 years ago.
18 years ago, yeah.
Yeah, 18 years ago. Book's been published about 15 years, and it's in its third edition. And now for the last 6 years, we have been running this global architectural history teaching collective, very generously funded by the Mellon, which I'm starting to feel comfortable calling a success
Mhm.
now that
Yeah.
we have pretty good membership, lots of people in it. Where can we take this? Are we taking this simply to take over and amplify the teaching of history in schools of architecture? Or is it a broader thinking? I mean, it seems to me that in the 21st century, I mean, this is sort of it's part of a spectrum in the world today which is looking to move out of the modern, right, and become after modern, uh, modern enlightenment classic, uh, in some way. That with the new horizons of being in the world, with the kind of imminence of climate change, I would like to say at this point, with the almost presence of artificial intelligence, with the sort of significant and continuing erasure of the nation state, broad spectrum challenges to patriarchy, uh, and with, from my perspective, the kind of fantastic advancements in the frontiers of astrophysics and our understanding of our place in the continuing understanding of our place or lack of place in the universe, and with globalization, globalization with all its complexities. Uh, with these sort of what are considered to be the big questions of our time, the sort of urgent questions, urgent problems. Hmm? I would like to be able to think that in some ways the quest of the global project contributes to those registers in some way.
Yeah. Let me go back to your idea
Mhm.
about after the modern. Um, what do you sort of
Mhm.
mean a little bit by that? Because I know you don't mean just postmodernism,
Yeah,
but what, in other words, is global climate problem, a scale that the modern just can't understand anymore? In other words, is it the scale?
right.
Modern claimed a
Yeah.
certain universalism, and it claimed big scale, but ultimately it gets undone by
Mhm.
the overscale being right of the global climate problem, the
Mhm.
collapse of the nation state ideologies, and so forth and so on. Right. So these are global problems, right? Because everyone is sort of now
Right.
enmeshed in these, whether we like it or not. Is that what you mean by after the modern? That the modern is we have to sort of give up?
What I think is that the project that was inaugurated around a modern subjectivity, which invested its faith in the idea that a stable slash universal human subjectivity could be deployed to
Mhm.
solve and know and understand the world and the universe in a manner that would at some point in the not too distant future
Mhm.
be like a done project, has
Right. That's right.
through its own investigations found itself to be it found itself to be an impossible project. And so it requires us, modernist project itself requires its, if you like, annihilation in the search for other after modern projects, other after modern subjectivities, ways of being in the world, and ways of knowing the world.
So we can think
Hmm.
of the modern project, its production of certain type of subjectivities and abstractions
Right.
and these things that you talked about. But
Hmm.
but we also know
Hmm.
that from the beginning, all of these
Right.
were constructed. All of these became corrupted, both literally and figuratively. Right? There's no such thing as uh,
Hmm.
the modern without its corruptions. So these things are really one produces in some sense
Right.
the other. So the the critique of the modern is not the critique of this strange
Mm-hmm.
its imminent collapse, right? But of its sort of transcendent collapse. And so I'm trying to sort of say that, in other words, it's the modern already was destined to collapse under
Right.
the
Premises.
falsification of its own ambition. So, okay, so we can imagine. I mean, just take any modernization project, anywhere in the world, and 100% it's connected to capitalist
Mm-hmm.
corruption, right? So I mean, just literally, right? So as a sort of the figurative example of all modernism, uh, you know, slated towards a teleological project that is
All
actually
right.
producing the opposite, right? A sort of a divorce, towards
Mhm.
some other chaotic
So you're reading
realities, right?
capitalism as the inevitable
So,
corruption of modernism?
well, I'm reading. I guess I'm sort of saying I'm reading modernism
Mm-hmm.
as a
Mm-hmm.
dualism. So it's 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 going to be the good and the bad, if you will, together in equal doses. So in other words, it produces these negations that it then uses
Mm-hmm.
to substantiate itself all the more. And vice versa, the more it substantiates itself, the more the critique
I
develops
see.
and says we need something else. Right. So it's a little bit the cat or the dog chasing its
And you
tail.
don't mean this in a Hegelian way,
It
right?
just
Or do you mean it this in a Hegelian way?
no, not a
Okay.
Hegelian dialectic, right? In other words, there's no destruction at the end of this that produces
There
the
is no
next thing,
sublation.
right? Right. There's no sublation, right? So it sort of just gets tighter and tighter, or the dog runs faster and faster until perhaps there are these sort of extreme formations that sort of veer out, in a way,
Mm-hmm.
around this. But some form of let's say, I would say, let's say, China using AI to monitor its entire
Mm-hmm.
population, right? So in some sense, where there's no place to hide except everything's hidden,
Right. Right.
So in other words, in a funny way, it reproduces that problem at an even more massive scale, and it's not destined to last because ultimately it's going to collapse. And it's not that it's going to collapse through making that which is hidden
Mm-hmm.
visible. It's just going to collapse into other formations of that which is empowered and that which is sort of disempowered, right? Whether it's perhaps in more local worlds, right, or
Okay.
not. So anyway, just to conclude, I'm just sort of saying that the critique of um, in other words, in this sort of spinning vortex, how does one establish a critique that, in some sense, doesn't entrap one either as one
Mm-hmm.
enters into it for being complicit in one side of the game or the
Mm-hmm.
other
Mm-hmm.
side of the game, right? Because as a scholar, as an intellectual, as a person living where I live, it could look like I'm pretty much, by my positioning, all a modern subject,
Yeah, but even the
right?
desire to
You
not
know,
enter into the discussion, so to say, objectively, is already a modernist position.
yeah, that's right, right. So, where does one enter is just as much a question as how does one, I guess you could sort of say, exit out of the modern.
Yes.
See what I'm saying? In other words, because how you enter it's a semi-subject position question
Mm-hmm.
that you have to sort of take pretty seriously. Without it, that it becomes either deadening, which is quite possible. You just
Mm-hmm.
sort of give up. It just whatever it is, right? Uh, or you enter a series of uh, predestined paths of critique. All globalization is some sort of
Right.
evil, right? And we have to critique evil. We have to critique globalization because it's sort of the determinant paradigm of
Hmm.
oppression. Whereas, I mean, I'm flying all over the world and giving lectures here. I mean, globalization is, without globalization, I
Right,
wouldn't have a
right, right,
career,
right.
right? Right. So, it's completely hypocrisy to pronounce some sort of radical critique and then not perform
Hmm.
it, through in very consistently. So, all of us are extremely inconsistent in this critique. So, how we that's what I'm sort of saying. How we enter in is part of the
Hmm.
problem, and that's where I think the
The
global,
term.
getting back to the core issue, is a sort of a entry mechanism rather than an exit
Right.
mechanism.
And I would agree with that. And when I said after modernism, I mean two or three things. One of the I, I don't think of it as a kind of an exit process. I mean, it's not a. I don't. I'm not looking in a sense for a door out into another room. Perhaps it is another room,
Hmm.
but the after modern is for me two things in the kind of issues that you are raising, which is that uh, it is still I am quite committed, if you like, to the modernist project, and I see
Hmm.
the after modern project in that sense still a modern project,
Hmm. Hmm.
uh, but not a modern project, one that finds itself questioning its own construction and even foundations.
Hmm. That's
So
right.
it's a bad term, after modern, and I
Yes.
perhaps don't like even postmodern. So whatever the term is, but it's for my head, it's still very much a modernist project in that sense.
Except that I think in your reading of it, it has to be another word that might come to fore here, but it's equally weirdly weird about it is sort of
Hmm.
ethics, because at some moment you have to make ethical decisions about where the modern is still modern in a way that's
Right.
productive to critical position, and in the way and where it gives you, unbeknownst or beknownst or unbeknownst, certain
Hmm.
illegitimate rights and powers, and some of those you simply can't
Hmm.
um, stop, right? You and I and basically all the millions of people around me, right, are complicit in the destruction of native
Right.
resources, native cultures, the destruction of
Right.
languages and environments all around, right? So we, in some sense, know that, but God, what are we actually are going to do about it? So some of us go and live in Vermont, some join political action campaigns, some just
Mm.
watch it what they buy at the store. I mean, there are, you know hundreds of different solutions. Some
Right.
basically.
So it's the question of your own personal agency, given the sort of larger narrative of society and politics and history.
There is, that's right, yeah, and you have to be comfortable with that, and you have to be comfortable also with the challenges that are coming from those who have made more profound have developed more profound
Hmm.
takes on the problem, right? So in
Hmm.
other words, I give money to Greenpeace, but I'm not out there on a
Right.
boat stopping the whaling. Now, someone could say, well, that's just,
Hmm.
liberal, greenwashing. And I'd have to
No,
say,
no,
yep,
no, no, no.
it
Let's not
is.
quickly move over that,
I
because
no.
in the span of your life is limited, and you only have that much time and that much agency. Uh, so the question is, and all projects, all agency. I mean, to one of the learnings of kind of late this sort of after modernism is that all individual agency is only uh, is only socially inscribed, right? Which is to say, uh, all
Right.
doings, all projects, all things we put together, even all authorship, can only be known and constructed as part of a broader matrix. So $50 to Greenpeace is can be recognized to be a part of that, which is unless the rest of your life you spend your time cutting down trees and building homes, right? But you could be doing a lot of other things,
Right.
uh, and in that sense, in the time and effort you have and the kind of agency you are available to you, uh, we are all pulling hopefully in the same direction of the boat. So I mean, I would not be comfortable with the sort of, so the question of ethics remains. I agree, uh, but the but that question of ethics cannot be reduced completely to a Marxist materialist kind of a position, wherein certain questions or certain kind of agencies are unquestionably of much higher value than others.
Right. Right. So yeah, I agree. In other words, the question of ethics does not mean that there is an ethical mandate of some sort of um, clear, identifiable, rationally
Right,
describable world, right? That says
right.
this is what you should be doing, right? So in other words, that would
Yes, that's
be
right.
the
Yeah.
old modern, right? So to speak, right? What point of view, right? There's a sort of a ethical approach, and you've got to be ethical. I mean,
Right.
or else, right?
Ethical in a particular way. Yeah, yeah,
Whereas the question of ethics,
yeah.
yeah, ethical in a particular way. That's right. Yeah. And this is largely the shadowy terror
Right.
of
Okay.
monotheism, in my view. The question of if the question of ethics, right, is something that is more haunting
Hmm.
to the subject position, because you have to find the question in places where you don't expect it
Or
or you
you
don't
don't
look
have
for
to
it,
find it. You
and
find
that
it in places where you don't expect it. Yeah.
yeah, that's right. You do.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. You do find it, but you also have, we know, one sense to sort of have a opening or a sensitivity towards
Hmm.
understanding that that is a question, because you may not know that it's a question until someone tells you it's a question, or somehow you find out that it's a question through reading or
Right.
learning or
Right.
whatever it is, learning about the world, right? So once again, if I can just pop in that
Hmm.
our complicated world, global, I think global is one of these words that allows that opening, among other things, the opening of the question of ethics to become more
Right.
visible in different ways. Admittedly, largely through the question of, well,
Right.
what is
Right.
history, right, as opposed to what is the value of whales in the Pacific. But that the question of history is an equally important problem, right, as to when and where and how do we value that which comes before us.
So, would you say that the global as a term, as a uh, let's say epistemology and ethics opening term, is necessarily only historical, or is it also, philosophical and epistemological? uh, is it a history question only, or is it also, can it also be described, let's say, from my perspective, as a turning towards science and let's say planetary thinking and astrophysics?
I'm with you 100%. I'm right behind you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
No, I mean, I love that you're
Yes,
you're
yes.
pushing it in that direction. It's certainly, it's certainly, I think, one of the things that I like about your contribution to that, because I that's something that I would have gravitated toward
Mhm.
by myself, or just on my own, right? Because I would have probably insisted on the sort of
Yes.
the history part of it.
Even the word phenomenologies of being in the world that are made available by thinking about other uh, histories, and that global history opens up. Uh, to access those is not simply a history question, it is also a question. uh, it is paralleled by it is paralleled and possibly intersected by the kind of, if you like, craziness which is emerging when one starts thinking about the
Mhm.
world as quantum, and isotropic, as in astrophysics.
Yes, yes, I can definitely see it. I mean, I think that it opens up the problem of our, I don't know, this the scale, the weird anomaly of the human world within these larger, quote unquote larger, but could be also molecularly small environments, which define us in some very profound way.
Yes. No, they don't define us. We are all made of quantum. The entire
Mm, yeah.
this is
Okay.
not a everything
All
that
right.
exists in the world is what is poorly called particles. And particles are actually vibrations of some kind. Uh, and
Uh-huh.
so so the questions that are posed by that, and the sort of profound difficulty uh, of the quantum world's relationship with the uncertainty present in what is known as
Mhm,
uncertainty, is what gives rise to
mhm, mhm.
quantum possibilities, uh, is fantastically, I think, interactively connected with the idea, with not the idea, with the act of knowing, uh, as Karen Barad has argued in Meeting the Universe Halfway, in a manner that is that to be able to start to access what that means and what its implications are, maybe something that the people in Lascaux and Chauvet perhaps knew to a certain extent better than we do now. So that's the sort of connection I'm trying to hope to make.
This sounds a little Hinduish to me. A little Vishnu. The metaphysics of the world and its relationship to body and
Yeah, yeah.
destruction and preserving, and these great
Hmm, hmm.
imaginaries, right, that come out of the Hindu tradition. Um, and you're
Modernist
trying to
science.
wash it in a
Yeah,
modernist
yeah,
sense.
yeah, yeah,
And I'm not saying,
yeah,
yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm not, I'm not
yeah.
trying to sort of demote it, because I mean, me, I'm always looking to find residues of these things,
Mm.
in that sense. So, but on the contrary, right? I mean, it's sort of the maybe new phraseology of it. But is there traces of this? I mean,
Mhm.
if I can maybe speak once again also too informally, if my struggle a little bit was with the
Yeah.
omnipresence and conflicted presence of Judaism, I would say,
Mhm.
trying to get past it and its culture of the
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
solitary logos, you know, and for me, potentially then global was in some sense a way, think of your like
Right,
modern getting after modern or getting out of it. So this
right.
was, I mean, I would say exit. not an entry, but an exit out
Right.
of sort of a monotheistic oriented world that I, for most of my life until 20 years ago, thought was completely
Right. Right.
normative. I never really thought of it as universal, but it was, right? And a huge struggle to sort of try to catch myself whenever I would feel, these
Right.
are
Yeah.
residues of that world's, goes through
Mhm.
underneath me. Right. So I'm looking at you, nerds, your background,
Yeah. Yeah.
not only in India, but with your father and your mother,
Yeah.
who's a
Vishnu Hindu. Yeah.
practicing,
Yeah. Yeah.
uh, yeah, 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 yeah. And that whole ceremony
Yeah. I took you for
that
a fire
you initiated
sacrifice
me
event. Yeah.
into, which
Yeah.
fire sacrifice, which I can, you know, I
Yeah.
could spend a half an hour
Yeah.
just telling the story of that. I mean, how wonderful, amazing that was.
I think that's a tremendous question. I mean, because perhaps it's true. I mean, to a certain extent, my struggle in life as a post-colonial is. I mean, when I look at it consciously, I think I'm more Jewish than Hindu, intellectually speaking, or perhaps even more Catholic because of my indoctrination into intellectual thinking and in general thinking through the Western ways of. So so and
That's right.
late in life,
Yeah.
I have felt that experienced that as a loss and a lack. I don't read Sanskrit. I
Hmm.
can't read, theory texts, and even in Hindi and Punjabi, the languages I can speak really well. Uh,
Hmm.
and a lot of my studies in starting to teach South Asia, and then from there Southeast Asia, and then from there branching off into global history, is a kind of a quest to try and reconnect, not reconnect, or sort of connect to these things. And therefore, a kind of
Hmm.
a excitement to do that, which you can call an erotic investment in doing all these things, can possibly be psychoanalyzed as a sort of a revalidation of experienced Hinduism in various ways. Yes, so all that is possible.
Hmm.
Um and to that extent, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But I think there is certainly a problem with saying, for instance, uh, well, the old Hindus had it right, and now is being verified by science.
For sure.
Yes,
I see what you
I
mean.
mean,
Yeah.
I mean
Yeah.
that's just
Right.
preposterous,
That's right.
right?
Yes, of course.
Uh,
That's right.
but I think what I am interested is that if the global that the ethics of the global as a history project uh, are not only political but are also uh, should also be. I'm interested in connecting or indexing or at least diffracting or bouncing off each them with the other, what I think are important epistemological projects in the world, which include contemporary modern science. So that's my interest
Mhm.
in trying to.
So
Yeah.
what about, yeah, so let me have another question. Because at the beginning, um, I sort of pointed out that the modern was sort of trapped in its own vortex of its own anti-modern, right? The modern and anti-modern, it's hard to tell which is
Hmm.
one and the other, right? There's a sort of a dualism at play. So one could either imagine that this dualism is, in other words, not a dualism
Hmm.
because it's an entrapped dualism, right? It's always one on the other, right? So we could imagine a harmony of that, which would be sort of a yin yang, but this would be the eternal disharmony of that, right? So then there's the transcendence of dualism in the world of some aspects of Hinduism, with Shiva, right? So where non-duality, in particular, let's say the non-duality of gender, right, is seen as the truth, right? Where duality is seen as sort of the world of human suffering through duality, right? Is for you the interest in science a space of non-duality?
I'm attracted to contemporary theory on science as I was attracted to contemporary French critical theory when it articulates itself in a way as trying to overcome the dualities of classical modernist thinking, yes, or classical Abrahamic thinking, yes. I mean, to a certain extent, a clear bias in my thinking is comes from the huge bias comes from Derrida, from reading Derrida, and who Habermas, if you remember, basically called him a renegade rabbi, right?
Mhm.
Habermas, right?
Of course,
Uh,
yeah.
because all this business of
Yep.
reading from the margins is like Kabbalah, right? All this business, there are a lot of sort of the text and the word and the texare and il n'y a pas hors du text, this sort of all these sort of thinkings that come out of him. And his first cousin, the entire psychoanalytic universe, uh, uh, with all its again push towards non-dualities and role of the unconscious and subconscious and so on, can be said to be is your world, your Jewish mysticism stuff, right? So my first attraction towards contemporary new materialism, in particular Karen Barad, who I've cited to you, uh, is through its recognition as being a derivation of French post-structuralism, which has, Habermas called it renegade Judaism, but has for a long time also been connected to Buddhist thinking, like you are describing it to be. This idea of non-duality in the Buddhist
Mhm.
way as shunyata are concepts that do connect in to post-structuralist psychoanalytic thinking. So, so in that sense, I
Mhm.
think one of the things that we have learned is that old Judaic stuff does interconnect with old Hindu stuff in modern global ways. Isn't that what global is?
Indeed, indeed. I think that um, you're right, and I think in one sense, it just goes to show the different ways to, you know, cut the fish, right? I mean, you can't. There's no one global that's going to fit all purposes. You got to,
Yeah.
and maybe getting back to the question of entry or exit, you know, maybe the entry, in other words, your biography gave you a certain entry. Well, in other words, your biography might have produced for you a desire for exit, but in a odd way, because of the way you approach the problem, it
Uh-huh.
allowed you also a re-entry that through, let's say, the ancillary project of
Hmm.
reading, analytics, self-critique, and these type of things, right, allowed you to, in some sense, sort of return to
Hmm.
the discomfort of uh, I don't want to say origin, but but discomfort of your
Right.
of the autobiography. Without that, it becomes itself explanatory, right? It is something that can be denied, but at the
Hmm.
same time, it is material that your subconscious uses in order to frame
Right.
its operations of critique.
Yes. So, yeah, yeah, and I think, yeah,
Yeah,
I mean,
and yeah,
this is one of the key kind of uh, the sort of psychoanalytic post-structuralists, post-colonial framings of knowledge, which is that uh, autobiography, or which is to say history, is not a matter of stories of origin. It's a matter of the inevitable uh, inevitable sort of residue, inevitable sort of presence in a palimpsestic way in whatever you are doing today of that in the present, not in a sort of simple,
that's right. That's right.
because you are Hindu, therefore you think Shiva had it right, may, but in the sort of in the in the frameworks, actings, agencies of things like desire uh, is an inevitable thing.
Hmm. Absolutely, and I think for me the
Mm.
problem of the Holocaust would be the thing that sort of determines the for me the problem of the global at every step of the way, even though I don't pronounce it ever. I don't ever, I mean, I admit it to you or others, but I'm not trying to make a lament about the Holocaust, but the Holocaust itself is the dark side of a particular
Yes.
problem of the modern, that the
Hmm.
global, if it's going to have any sort of success, because it's argument about being world open, not about liberal tolerance, but
Hmm.
by being open, um, perhaps can keep the problem of the Holocaust, which is an eternal issue of the modern, in one way or the other, at bay.
That's
So,
fascinating. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
for
Go on.
you, it is. Well, I was just gonna, think about our own relationship, because for you, the coming out of India, out of the depth of a particular
Mhm.
type of culture around your parents, who were themselves, looking to straddle the
Mhm.
modern and what you might want, whatever, the deep, um, uh, you know, and your own sort of
Mhm.
escape mechanisms and reentry mechanisms, over time, produce a certain
Right. Right.
fingerprint of thought, that is definitely part of
Uh-huh.
a post-colonial worldview, but has a unique flavor of your own, given that you're no longer, I would sort of think, quite in, maybe it's a intimidated by the problem of what,
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, Hinduism or
Right.
Vishnu, whatever might represent. You sort of grown past the 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 problem of those who try to narrow it
I hope
into some
so.
operative
I
agendas.
hope so. Yeah. It has. I would admit that it has taken a certain amount of courage for me to speak Vishnu modernism uh, without easily using the bracket of I am simply speaking
Hmm.
for a certain tradition, and so therefore this is history, culture, and anthropology. But to sort of begin to access it in the theater of contemporary critical thinking, which is, I think, one of the, for me, the part of the ethical objective of the global, from my perspective, from my autobiography graphing, because it would be so amazing to be able to enter those epistemologies into the thinking of the world, uh, today and tomorrow
Mhm.
in critical ways.
Mhm.
Um,
That's right.
but I want to spend so
Yeah.
1 second and note for you. You know, if there is an idea which I think I would like to, I need to. I think I could be said to be guilty of uh, uh, sidestepping, given all my claims to connections with neurotic Jewish intellectuals, is that the Holocaust, I must admit, has never been a haunted presence in my life or my thinking. I have never thought about the Holocaust. I certainly didn't while I was in India. It's not a presence in the history and consciousness of India, even in my modernist education. And it has taken me a
Mhm.
lot
Mhm.
of being told and again to begin to start to know its
Mhm.
deep shadow in in the West, particularly amongst uh, I suppose Jewish intellectuals. So this is something I would love to, through you and others, sort of get deeper into. Um,
Well, um, I hear what you're saying, and I can, and I'd love the honesty of what you're, admitting. And in the same way that I didn't grow up in a
right.
post-colonial, problem, and basically I only encountered it
Hmm.
when I started really teaching
Uh-huh.
in Cornell, and
Right.
then
Right.
it was purely a theoretical thing because I wanted to learn about it, and I was eager to find out and read everything about it. But it never felt like I know what they're talking about, right? I mean, I could sort of imagine what
Mhm,
they're talking about, but
mhm,
it's not like I sort of could deeply feel it, right? And you were really the first person I knew,
mhm, mhm.
that was very different because you were embedded in it, right? You came to Cornell
So
already
yeah.
armed and you know ready to go. you know, Whereas I was for a long time I had to play catch up, and still today, I feel like even though I'm completely versed in post-colonial theory, I'm not. I feel uncomfortable
Right.
describing myself in any way as.
Yeah. I mean, can I describe myself as a post-Holocaustian?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Might be a little awkward. But on the other hand, if we think not in the disciplinary formation, but with the
Hmm.
small p or maybe a small h, right?
Hmm.
Certainly, India, just think of partition and you think of all sorts of terrible things, right? That certainly are on the nature of
Sure.
holocausts, right? Um, it may not be exactly of the same nature, but the
Hmm.
relationship of the state, to the individual
Hmm. Hmm.
at the level of abject brutality,
Sure.
um, is not something that only Jews experience, but around the world, right? So, and certainly in India, um, the whole history of the birthing of the nation is just an extended uh, uh, diagram of various types of holocausts.
Yeah, I've been trying to sort of say, okay, we have this problem, but okay, we understand other people also have this problem. No, it's not true, Mark. I mean, the trauma of partition, I don't think, is anywhere near, it seems to me, the trauma of Holocaust.
I, I don't know. I would think it might, you know, um, and once again, when it might have to say, and this
Mm,
is, okay, here I'm going on fumes, right? The voicing of the problem of the Holocaust as an identity making project, which was key to good segment of intellectual Jewish,
mhm,
you know, post war, the post war project, um, may not have been, let's say, quite as strongly found as sort of disciplinary voice in India, except, let's say, with the rise of Hindu nationalism. In other words, where it comes up not as sort of a problem of remembrance, but as a problem of violence itself. You see what I'm saying? In other words, it just sort of shifts from
Right.
into its most natural state of violence. Whereas one of the things about the Jewish Holocaust was that the Jews were never empowered apart from Israel. Now let's leave the Israel question. I'm talking about sort of American Judaic intellectual tradition, right? Translated itself into a type of disciplinary humanities project, support for the arts, humanities education, and things like that, right? So there's a cleavage between sort of the Israeli nationalist project and the American Jewish intellectual project, right? So, because the Holocaust very clearly, at some level, given its capacity and scale, can easily morph into a pro-nationalist project or ethnocentric project or whatever you might want to call those, right? Zionism, you know.
So I wonder if that's a key difference between, I mean, your project, if one wants to reduce it down to a post-Holocaustian ethical project, that the global for you is a post-Holocaustian ethical articulate. I wonder, and for me, it's a post-colonial ethical articulate. I wonder if the difference can be structured around, uh, are we hosted by the by the nation, or that if your project is haunted by the not Israel state, therefore articulated variously into humanities. For me, the partition problem was articulated or sort of sublated or solved, if you like, by the Nehruvian nation state. And so I can comfortably stand here and say, I am still committed to the modernist project, i.e., slash, yes, Nehruvian project.
Yeah, that was your dissertation. Yeah,
Yes, yes,
you
yes.
were working it out. You were working it out in your dissertation. All of that.
So yeah, I mean, in that sense, I sit comfortably in the nation state because I think of it as the Nehruvian world, and can happily work with modernism and science because those sort of deeply enshrined by this sort of fantastic Nehruvian buildings and projects, and my father's work in the agricultural universities and all his scientism. And to that extent, I can see my work, even though I sit here in the United States and with a US citizenship, and I definitely see myself as at least as a passport holding US national. Uh, I can continue to push the global as the deconstruction of the modern and comfortably sort of avoid and sidestep the social and the political question. Because that to a certain extent seems solved for me. Not solved, but kind of it has a certain form. The modernist state, the modernist, some kind of a modernist political form seems to me to be the democratic liberal, form seems to me to be good enough and adequate, a framework from within which to pose and think through philosophy, physics, science, and history.
Okay, but let me interrupt. If we think of the modern nation state, I mean, as a sort of I'm adding the nation state, but the word modern, nation state as a type of
Mhm.
symptomatic practice of what we might call the modern, right? Right. One of the things the modern nation state has to do, this is especially in Asia and India for sure, right, is sort of
Right.
solve the problem of the periphery,
Yes,
which is
yes,
the
yes,
problem
yes.
of the tribal, the first societies, the mountain people, the hill people, whatever you want to call those people, right? Right. And it does that in extremely brutal ways. That yeah, okay. So but these ways that it does this are called law, education, job programs, and so forth and so on, right? They're no longer enslaved. They're no longer necessarily brutalized in the traditional sense of how you might sort of deal with so-called
Hmm.
these people that were called primitives or savages, right? So now the nation state comes and says, okay, you're going to have to be on, go to work in a factory. You're going to have a bank account. You're going to
Right.
have languages. You're going to have all these type of things, right? And it does all of that in a very constructedly half-assed way to make sure that these people remain sort of
Okay.
disempowered within the very structure of power.
Well, yes and no. I mean, obviously, I'm not defending the.
No. I'm not saying you are. I'm not saying you are. I'm just sort of saying now that if one basically sees in other words, the teleology of the modern is that this is just going to be a
Yes.
transition until finally everyone is accounted for, and then we're done. My point here is that temporal
Hmm.
zone, or we want maybe the geopolitical zone, is the zone of a tough Holocaust. You may think that's too extreme, but I'm sort of saying that the Jewish Holocaust, where people were, burnt in the oven,
Hmm.
was was in some sense a formation of that went into the extreme, but is not any different in terms of where the arrows are pointing from the nation state's attempt to deal with its marginal populations.
I think if the modernist liberal project is defined as creating a singular universal subjectivity, which necessarily involves, therefore, the elimination of all subjectivities that are not considered to be universal, which is certainly a version of the formation of the modernist project, then yes. But
Mhm.
if we more loosely define the modernist project as the project of representation, and the uh, securing the rights to be present in the parliament of united humanity, not united, but sort of, or the
Mhm.
liberal democracy, not
Mhm.
democracy, the
Mhm.
liberal representation project in general, uh, then the critique that the modernist project, that the nation state's silencing of non-modernist voices, that critique, that the nation state silenced non-modernist voices, that critique still is done from the liberal position that those voices deserve to be heard. So
Correct.
so the
Yes, I
nation
agree with
state
that.
as a political formation, I can agree that the Nehruvian state in that sense, as articulated, can be connected to, so one can see the Nazis as a subversion of the modernist nation state, if that's what you're arguing. But uh,
Mhm.
its critiques, its directions as political formations, uh, as social political formation, is still a position that I think the liberal position of the necessity of enabling proper representation is still a valid enough position for me.
And I think I would also agree with that. I just would say that added, to the problem, right, is the difference, if you will, between and this gets a little bit to my emerging,
Mhm.
I don't know, problem a little bit with Derrida, right, between a
Uh-huh.
writing centric and an oral centric worldviews. So, you
Well,
know, Derrida critiques orality as as the logos, problem, against which there is no possibility of critique because it sort of speaks and it pronounces itself, right? Whereas as soon as things come down in writing, you can begin to trace uh, the, the problems, right? Because you need writing and in some sense to sort of
mhm.
find the archive of problematic.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So it basically the Jewish medieval project against sort of the early Judaic
Mhm.
Yahweh as logos project. And I've been really, interested in now we deal what happens then about, I think that his misreading of orality is in other words, there's other types of, let's say, orality rather than the orality that's written down
Right.
as spoken by God making pronouncements. So what we have
Yeah.
in, let's say, non-modern worlds
Yeah.
is a plethora of, and non-Western in particular, that's right, a plethora
Right.
of other forms of oralities that simply don't fit into anything that a nation state can do because nation state has got to put everything down in writing. And so the only way to, solve that, right, is to, in some sense, muscle the written world into everything. Then you can, of course, establish then the post facto critique. But this is maybe again, once again, where that sort of initial question about, well,
Mhm.
where does the ethical find itself, right? In worlds that are not silent as such, but are silent to the nation state, because the nation state
Mhm.
doesn't have Buddha's ear to the ground. Nation state has got a computer and typewriting, right? And bureaucracies and ledgers and textbooks and whatever, law, constitutional rules and stuff like that, right?
Right.
So getting back to, you know Buddha's ear question, where does, that there's a sort of a border issue between the written and the oral world that I think the global needs to understand and figure that out a little bit.
I have always read Derrida's critique of orality as specifically from within the Western Abrahamic tradition, which a particular medieval condition, as you said, which thinks of orality as connected to the soul in a particular way, into a singular origin-based subjectivity, and so it's a critique of that thinking, which present in modern culture as the signature and the sign of a unified subject. uh, I think that critique, it would be perilous, yes, I agree with you, to apply that critique, therefore, to all orality, including not just non-Western oralities or the Buddha's ears, but also, uh, ancient oralities and Chauvet oralities and various kinds of oralities. But that project remains. That's the global history project. That's the project you and I are doing, because we can now, because you and I function in the haloed institutions of Western Civ. uh, there is this space in these haloed institutions, traditionally, the truth of being in the sort of Western subjectivity sense was to be privileged. Now, if that is deprivileged or decentered, then there is the space created to articulate other Buddha ear to the ground oralities. But these need to be known.
Yes, 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 yes. No, I think you clarify that very well. Yeah, I think Derrida is basically saying that, in some sense, phonocentrism was, if I don't want to say manipulated, or was exploited by monotheism to produce a privileged,
Hmm.
self-expressive subject positioning
Right.
that is a sort of a dead end street, right? But and therefore writing is the
In the
way you
particular
can
context, yeah, yeah,
work around that,
yeah, yeah.
right? Because writing, yes, that's right. Right, and it's not just writing down, but the writing on writing and writing on writing on writing. In other words, the iterativeness of writing, the non-endingness that allows
Hmm.
critique to find its ways in the gaps and fissures, could only happen once you start writing, because then it sort of doesn't ever, it can never
Right.
find its sort of teleological claims that even it's written about. So, but there is the, let's say, the box that falls at the off at the back of the truck, that this is a wholesale critique of orality, which would be probably wrong. I mean, I don't know if he's ever talked about what his
He
views
did.
are on.
He often put between. He put many
Oh yeah,
times in
what
his
did he
texts
say?
in Western civilization. And
Yeah,
once he was asked about its possible connections to Buddhist thinking, and he said that sounds interesting, but I don't really know anything about it.
yeah.
I mean, he just, yeah,
Okay. Well, I'm glad he said that, but it also shows,
yes,
in some sense, the limitation of his critique in these other contexts, right? So, the and it also reverses the charges in some sense, because if you go to places with very
hmm,
strong, what we would call oral traditions, it's actually uh, writing centrism
okay,
that
yeah,
is a teleological problem,
hmm, hmm,
right? It's almost the opposite, because as soon as writing comes in, it corrodes, purposefully corrodes, the complicated oral communicative structures that humans have developed between each other, between themselves and the landscape and
right,
nature,
right,
between the birds and the rocks, and all these type of things, right?
yes,
And writing basically erases that completely.
right, all right. Thanks for being a partner on Architecture Talk. Thank you for listening to Architecture Talk. This is Vikram Prakash, your host, and our producer is the one and only Sammy Prouty, a graduate student of architecture here at the University of Washington in Seattle. I hope you all enjoyed our conversation, and if you did, please do take a moment to subscribe and to rate us on iTunes. See you next time. Take care. Goodbye.